Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the panel titled Future of Workforce Engagement. This panel is hosted jointly by NYU's Center for the Future of Management and NYU's Future of Work and Organizations initiative. We have an excellent lineup of speakers today who you will learn more about in just a moment. Here's the format. We'll start with some brief introductions of each of the panelists, and then we'll jump into a moderated discussion. After that, we will take audience questions. And one programming note, please use the Zoom Q&A feature to enter your questions. We'll get to as many of these as we can. Okay, let me turn to some introductions. Julia Lamb is a partner in PwC's workforce transformation practice, focusing on financial services clients. She has more than 15 years of experience helping clients address complex organization transformation challenges driven by disruption from digitization, regulation, deals, business model changes, and cost pressures. In addition to her work with clients, Julia is a featured thought leader at PwC and is often cited in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNBC, Business Insider, Time, Fast Company, and New York News 12. Julia has an MBA from NYU Stern's School of Business, so she's an alum, and we're always happy to have our alums. She also has a BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So thank you, Julia, for joining us. We're also joined by Aiwa Shirako. Aiwa is the lead of Google's People Innovation Lab, Pi Lab for short, where her team is responsible for research to inform the future of work. She marries people analytics and design thinking to solve complex organizational problems across policy and practice, and has been responsible for the design, implementation, and evaluation of equitable, data-driven people programs at Google. Prior to Google, Aiwa served as a visiting professor of management and organizations here at NYU Stern. She received a PhD and MS in business administration with a concentration in organizational behavior from the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. This isn't scripted, but I have to say that Aiwa and I were classmates at UC Berkeley. So Aiwa, it's good to have you again. Kim Korfman is going to be moderating the discussion. Kim is my colleague here at NYU Stern. She's a professor of marketing and vice dean for online learning at the NYU Stern School of Business. She has served as vice dean for MBA programs, academic director of the Langone part-time MBA program, and coordinator of the doctoral program in marketing. Professor Korfman's research interests include individual and group creativity, affect, group decision-making and judgment, and social influence. Her work has been published in such journals as the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, Psychological Bulletin, Journal of Retailing, Marketing Letters, and Multivariate Behavioral Research. Professor Korfman received a BA from Princeton University and an MBA and PhD from Columbia University. So I'm going to hand things over to Kim, who will take us through the moderated discussion. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Rob. I am delighted to be here with two such perfect panelists to talk about workforce engagement in this crazily, rapidly changing world. Julia, I'd like to start with you. One of the things that PwC does that's very interesting and valuable is track high-level trends. What new trends are you seeing in interactions between employers and their employees?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Kim, and I'm very excited to be here, everyone. It's been a super fascinating time, just given everything happening over the last 2 years from a workforce perspective. I think the thing that's been picking up speed over the last, 4 or 5 months especially has been this great resignation trend. And there's so many other names that are out there for it that are a little more optimistic than that. But we're finding, that's being driven by a lot of different things. I think one is certainly suppressed resignations over the course of COVID. A lot of people were very cautious about what was going to happen to their careers. And so they were not jumping. And so they kind of stayed in place, stayed with their employers to the extent they were able to be staying in employment, because obviously there's a lot of unfortunate turnover. But essentially people just didn't move. So I think some of this is what you would have seen over that course of time. We also are seeing, generally speaking, employees have been faced with a lot in their personal lives, and many people dealing with themselves or loved ones who were either sick or, dealing with other consequences, lots of mental health issues, things like that in the workforce. So I think we're seeing a lot of people just sort of question, hey, life is really short. And why am I staying in a job that, I'm not getting that much fulfillment from? And so you're seeing, record numbers of people exit the workforce voluntarily month over month, with last month still being around 4 million. I think the third trend I would just hit on is really what's happening from a growth perspective in the economy. So that is keeping the growth and the talent demand very, very high, higher than normal. And when you couple all these factors together, you really see companies now being strained because they don't have the power. They can't attract talent fast enough to basically fill the talent need. So it's a combination of those three factors that's really creating this unique environment. And certainly the power is with the employees while that hot market kind of retains.
Yeah. Iowa, is it your sense from your work at Google or your general understanding of the tech landscape that similar things are happening elsewhere?
Yeah, no, all of that really resonates for me. I think sort of the trends you mentioned, Julia, really speak to employees having a lot more bargaining power, and that's definitely something that I think is true across the industry. I think, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on whose perspective you take, at Google and similarly positioned tech companies, the employees have had that power for a while. They could easily find another job down the street at a similarly paying place. So we think a lot about how to attract and retain our employees and keep them really engaged via being really competitive with our benefits and compensation and so forth. But I think zooming outwards, like Julia said, really a lot of people in the pandemic times, and we are kind of still in a pandemic, reprioritize their values, right? And suddenly the working 60, 80 hours a week or more, A, might have become impossible for various reasons, and B, just felt a lot less appealing. And so I think there's a lot of movement, not a ton at Google, I would say, but a lot of people thinking about how do they want to optimize their time. So yeah, definitely seeing those kinds of trends.
So it sounds, Iowa, like Google has had, well, it's possibly that they've had the challenge of having very attractive employees for a very long time because other companies want to employ them. Does that mean they were ahead of the curve on figuring out how to retain employees? Are there, what have they done in terms of workforce engagement that others are now discovering?
I think some of the broader trends that I think I've seen are things around more training and flexibility in terms of on the job switching, those kinds of things. I think those are things that Google has done for a really long time, and that's sort of encouraging internal mobility. So if someone's ready to move on for the project or team or role they're on, there are lots of other open roles at Google, and there's a lot of flexibility in terms of taking those roles. So that's definitely something that we've focused on a lot in the past, and we try to make that really low friction. So if you're a software engineer working on project A, pretty easy. Just talk to the manager of project B, and if it seems like a good fit, you can pretty much just swap over. Maybe a tiny bit more complicated than that, but about that easy. It's also relatively easy internally to, well, harder, it takes effort, but to switch careers entirely, right? So I sit in HR. Lots of my colleagues over the course of the years have decided they want to do something else besides wherever they happen to be in HR, and moved over and become software engineers, or gone to UX or what have you. So we have internal trainings to support that. We have internal opportunities, 20% projects, or bungees, which is you take a temporary role while someone's out on leave, ways for people to get on the job training if they want to switch careers, switch roles, and things like that. So had a lot of that support around for a while, and I think it continues today as we want to hold on to our very excellent employees.
So Julia, are you seeing this kind of thing more broadly now? And what other kinds of things are you seeing companies do to try to retain their workforce?
Yeah, I mean, and really Google's obviously in a great place, right? Because you have a very strong brand that's going to attract employees. So many of our clients don't have that asset. So they're looking at all the other benefits and employee experiences that they can provide. Just interesting, we had recently surveyed executives, and this is back a couple of months ago, but executives, basically a variety of C-suite individuals, about 800, to basically get their take on, what are the things you're doing to attract and retain those employees. The top item on the list was offering hybrid work options. Obviously, that's disproportionate for the industries where you can offer hybrid working arrangements. But the vast majority of organizations said they implemented those over COVID, 43%. But then some are saying they're also going to revisit that because now that people are coming back and we're kind of getting into this next phase of normal, really being able to give that perk to employees. The second highest item on the list was career advancement and giving employees upskilling. So Iowa hit on that with learning, but also really thinking about, hey, giving people stretch roles, giving them new opportunities, trying to help them move upwards, both vertically as well as horizontally within the organization. Compensation's on the list. Making remote work a permanent option is number 4 on the list. And actually, interestingly, here at PwC, we, from a professional services perspective, we already kind of had a hybrid working model prior to the pandemic. When you think about a classic management consulting model, it's Monday through Thursday, you fly out, and then Friday you work from home or you go to the office if anyone's there. And sometimes there's some variation in there. We actually opened up to all of our employees at PwC the option to basically opt into either being remote or a flex work assignment. And the idea with remote is, maybe you have to still go on site like 1 day a week. And I think the formal guidance was 1 to 3 days at most. But it's not every day getting back into that. Flexible is that you're 1 to 3 days on site per week. So the idea being there's just a little bit more structure around that. And we had no idea how many employees would opt into this. So it was a little bit risky when we kind of threw that out there. But it was about 20% of the workforce that opted into the all remote. And then the other 80% kind of stayed in the flex work. So, vast majority still saying, we don't want to be in, the old everyday 5 days a week, though some people, of course, prefer that personally. But really having that remote option was something that people really liked. And I will say it also shot up our external applications by 30% when we added the all remote option. So, opening up to new markets, states where, we might not have an office or people are not as close to airports, so they can't travel. It's just really interesting to see how that is and how people opted in. A couple other things on the list here in terms of what companies are implementing. Benefits, allowing employees to permanently relocate. So again, kind of tying into that remote option. And then really relying on more third-party outsourcing. So the vendors and things like that to fill talent gaps.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about recently and having conversations with the leadership team at Stern about is the employees who leave. And maybe we don't know a lot about them yet and how happy they are to have left. But there's this notion that wherever you go, there you are. Do you have a sense of how many people have left because things didn't feel right, but then they went to a new role or a new company and found, whoa, this is me in a new situation and I still have the same issues? Either whoever.
I don't have hard data on it, Kim, but I have been hearing sort of more anecdotally than through a survey that it's been coined the great regret. I don't know if you've all read this one too. There's all these greats, right? But this idea that people jump and the reality is onboarding to a new organization right now in a flexible virtual environment when many organizations are defining like, what is this? What's our new normal? Is really challenging. And you also, a lot of people are entering an environment where they've taken a promotion, they've taken a significant comp raise, and the expectations on them in that new environment are much higher than before. Yes, exactly. So we're seeing a lot of people boomerang back or quickly go to an organization. It lasts for a couple months, they can't keep up, and then they're moving on. And so it's been really interesting. I mean, I think we're going to see this one play out in the next 6 months to a year. Iowa, I don't know if you've been seeing similar things your teams.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have hard data either, but I think anecdotally, that's definitely what I've been hearing a lot of especially sort of in this very employee has a lot of strength and bargaining power labor market. You might get a really, really lucrative job offer from somewhere else and decide this is the time to take the plunge. And then either the expectations are really different. I've also heard a lot of expectations were very unclearly defined and poorly communicated. So the job you thought you were getting is not the one you got. And then sometimes you get there and you realize that what you loved about work was actually your colleagues, and the culture of the new place is not a great fit, right? So I think I've been seeing a lot of movement for the very, very tempting compensation packages, and the discovery once there that it's obviously a hugely important part of why we work, but it's not everything about work, right? So, yeah.
You both alluded to the challenges of onboarding in this weird environment, both because it's unsettled, the place you go doesn't really know what they're doing yet, with few exceptions. And we're also learning how to onboard people, how to build community, how to work together in this new environment to us. And I think we're learning. We're certainly better than we were in spring of 2019 or 2020. Are you seeing specific things companies are learning to do to make that work better?
Amongst my clients, I'm seeing a lot of companies get a lot more structured around their onboarding process and trying to define what that looks like. Even when it comes down to, some of the onboarding to understanding, not just what the paperwork you fill out, getting the tour if you're going in for onboarding, but really onboarding around like culture, working norms, and we're starting to embed a lot of the hybrid working expectations into that. But also getting really specific around how to create relationships. So we're seeing, someone who used to might go and to an onboarding that was more traditional in person, you'd kind of go to your, 3-hour session and then go find your desk and you meet your buddy, or you meet, someone from the team comes to meet you. And then you walk around and you kind of meet people, in the halls and things like that. Now we're giving people and seeing people receive these sort of very structured, here's the people in your team, here's who you need to set time up with. In some cases, the time's already on the calendar. So that person has a really good, fix on the first couple of days. But also, I think the last piece is really thinking about that onboarding process lasting for a long time. And that the reality of time to productivity, how long it's going to get to that person to be able to, really show the worth and show the value, measuring that, but also making sure there's a lot more checkpoints along the way so that companies can intervene. And I think this is increasingly challenging right now because so many of the people who are, staying at the organization are the ones who are, one, they're carrying the brunt of people who've left, but they're also carrying the brunt of recruiting and carrying the brunt of onboarding. So it's also causing this like very circular kind of strain in the short term while new people join. So I think that's one more reason companies are getting pretty deliberate about it, because before you do things out of like the goodness of your heart and being a good teammate, and now everyone's stretched so thin, it's hard to actually deliver that.
Yeah. Iowa, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say that the stretched so thin part just really, really resonates. It's been a weird couple of years, but just, on onboarding more broadly, at Google, we really had to, everybody had to shift really quickly in terms of how things were done, right? And if we rewind 2.5 years, all the onboarding, you sort of went to a formal onboarding thing and met all the other people who were starting the same day across function and had this in-person program. And we obviously had to quickly shift that to an entirely online system. And I think the thing that we thought a lot about that I think is going pretty well was what has to happen synchronously versus asynchronously, right? And that's true of work, across work. We have to think about that more deliberately. But what are the onboarding activities that I can do on my own, like complete a training or whatever it is, versus the things that would really benefit from having other people, even if it's virtual, to talk to about or to learn from or something like that. So that's some of the onboarding stuff that we focused on pretty early on. And then I think Julia, to echo what you said, lots more deliberate thought about making sure there are buddy systems or those types of support for new employees.
Actually, those sound like things that would have been good to have even before we got to this point. And it actually leads to another question, which is kind of at a higher level. These trends you're seeing, which do you think are transitory and which ones do you think are going to be more permanent shifts?
I can jump in first if you want. I think that, so at Google, we're going with a hybrid model, just like everyone else, which is that most employees will be in the office about 3 days a week. Obviously, if you want to be in 5 days a week, that's an option as well. We've increased our locations over the course of the pandemic. We've invested in real estate and continue to expand out our offices even when no one was there to use them, and also have really increased our remote population. Not every job is eligible to be remote. Some of them require you to be on site, but we expect that some 20% of our workforce eventually, we're not there yet, will likely be remote. And as we've started to return to the office, right, in the past few months, it's really picked up and sort of transitioning to the hybrid work week and work model. What I hear really strongly from our employees, and I see it across articles, so I think it's true of probably everyone, but especially the knowledge worker sector, is the desire for the flexibility and autonomy and ability to keep that, right? So if you tell me that I'm supposed to be in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, then my question might be, but do I have to be there this Thursday? Is it every Thursday? You didn't used to monitor whether I'm going to be there. Is that still going to be true? And so I think that sort of desire for flexibility and autonomy will remain. For me, it raises at least two really interesting considerations, right? One of which is this works at Google because we have the tools for it, right? Unless you have to be in a lab or something like that, we have all the online tools and the laptops and shipped everyone monitors and all the stuff. How does this translate to other industries, or is it just a very two-tiered system? So I think that's one that really is top of mind for me. And then another one, Julia, you mentioned all the new remote options, right? And so people who were somewhere where there wasn't an airport close enough or something like that, this is going to mean that there's a transfer of people and wealth to communities where it wasn't in the past, and that's going to have an effect, to keep it neutral, on local communities. And we don't know. Historically, I think such things don't usually go in the right direction, and so it's really unclear what's going to happen with these types of trends. But so one, I think, is that desire for flexibility and autonomy, and then I think the second one is if everybody wants to be more flexible and more autonomous and work from where they want to work, then we are going to continue to need to work with even more distributed teams, people in different locations, or even maybe I'm in New York City with someone, but they are at home and I'm at my desk or whatever it is. So having the right technology and workspaces, desks, meeting rooms, policies, best practices for how to make that work is going to continue to be a really hot topic going forward, I'd say.
I completely agree with.
And one more. Hold on. One more. I just have to do one more. The focus on well-being, and I am hopeful that this focus on well-being is not a little blip that we cared about because it was a pandemic and then it goes back to it. But I think that the shift in sort of how leadership has talked about sort of the importance of well-being has gone from a little more lip servicey to kind of actually, oh no, we need to really, really invest in this space. And so I hope that also continues, because as we become more and more digitally connected, it's going to be harder and harder to disconnect from our day-to-day work. So sorry, Julia.
No, that's fine.
Just before Julia jumps in, I want to remind the audience to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and we will get to your questions in probably about 5 minutes. Julia.
Yeah, great. And I completely agree with the trends that I was hitting on. It's kind of interesting because every 7 to 10 years or so, there seems to be this cycle on this increased focus of flexibility. Never quite like this one, because this is definitely a high in terms of the demand. But when the economy is doing well, companies do tend to start to use flexibility as one of those main levers, in addition to compensation, that they use around trying to attract and retain talent. So we certainly have seen these periods before. I think the couple that I would add on are, everyone going through the virtual collaboration change management curve. We really didn't see as many companies comfortable with using video to communicate, or really using asynchronous communication and technology that enables teams to kind of come together. So all of the adoption for that. I still remember, day one of the pandemic, one of my clients, a bank, one of the large banks based in New York, had 8,000 employees who did not have access to log in from home on the first day. And it's shipping out laptops, it's trying to figure out how we get through that. Everyone's gotten through that curve. So I think that, the virtual working and all of that's here to stay. I think the other one that is probably a pile on to your points, Iowa, is really, the generational preferences coming up. Millennials, now Gen Z, prefer to have flexibility and autonomy in the way they work. And they are early adopters of technology because they've grown up with it. They're digital natives. So I think that this style is something that most people in the workforce will be preferring very, very soon. And so that's already changed. So I just add those two to the list that Iowa had started us out on.
So Julia, related to something that the kinds of things that Iowa was talking about, do you think that large firms are in a better position to hold on to employees than small firms, given some of the tools that she described using?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kim, and I don't feel strongly one way or the other. I do think that the companies that were able to really embrace the employee experience and be empathetic leaders and put the employee first and restructure their ways of working quickly to accommodate the pandemic probably did better or did better than others in terms of attracting and retaining talent. The big companies, obviously, many of them have the brand, and sometimes that's beneficial, sometimes it's not. But you're going somewhere where you're probably going to be able to rely on the paycheck and things like that. But I do think the smaller companies probably were able to pivot more quickly because they don't have all this organizational overhead and processes and approvals and things you have to do to, approve a flexible work arrangement. So small companies might be poised a little bit better to be agile and adapt to change. But, big companies, I think they've got other strengths and obviously they can, get access to the finances to raise comp and things like that a little bit more quickly than some of the smaller ones.
What advice would you give to current and graduating MBA students about how to manage being an employee in this environment? Iowa, you want to take that?
Sure. I think that as you're thinking about, internships or full-time employment, and I saw that I was hard to hear, so I'll try to speak up a little bit. The paycheck is obviously a huge reason for why we get jobs. That's critical, but I think really keeping in mind the other things and thinking critically about what you want to be optimizing for is key, right? And so right after you finish your MBA, paying back those loans is pretty top of mind, right? Or getting a foothold into your next career. So the first steps of your next career, those things are really important. But also the things that are gonna make you want to stay are whether you find your work meaningful or whether you really enjoy your colleagues or you like your manager and find them to give you good sort of coaching and direction, right? So those things are going to be the things that make you want to stay in the job you take. And so if you can find those and the paycheck, that's a good place to get started.
And I might just add on one. I recall, and obviously I graduated when it was a very different time. Everyone was in person for the most part, but I did notice, very soon, I think the 1 year mark, the 2 year mark, you saw a lot of people leave whatever job they've gotten out of Stern. I came straight to PwC, so I was one of the few who's still at the place they interned at and then came back to, funny enough. But I would say, in general, put your whole self into the job because it's a very small world. I see a lot of people I used to be in class with out in the professional world. I see, my former clients come to PwC, former colleagues on the team go to clients, and now they're buyers. And so, I just think about your brand and how you interact with people. Obviously, there's a social media brand that you can use to kind of help people understand who you are and what you're working for. But all those personal recommendations and relationships are really going to pay dividends down the road. So I would say, keep putting your best foot forward, even if you happen to, go to a job that's not exactly, what you had hoped, or, you have different challenges in it.
Yeah, great advice from both of you. Got a question kind of related to the brand question. When giving employees the option of remote, hybrid, full-time, in person, how are you thinking about potential discrepancies in how FaceTime and being present, in physically present, affects recognition and promotion?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So thanks for the question. This one's really fascinating because I don't think anyone truly knows the answer right now. How we're tackling it at PwC with that remote and then that hybrid population is everyone is held to the same performance standards. We've got pretty clearly defined competencies at PwC. One's whole leadership, relationships, business acumen, technical acumen, and global and inclusive. And whether you're a new joiner or whether you're a experienced partner, you are held to the same, obviously within different levels, different expectations, but the same 5 things. I think the one we're starting to see play out a little bit different between the remote and the in-person or hybrid population is the relationships one. I've got teams right now where some of the teams has opted into hybrid and some opted into virtual. And we're starting to see, the clients are back, so that some of the teams back on site. They've done a really good job creating team norms around how they're going to interact, rules around hybrid meetings. If even one person is virtual, they all have screens on in the room, things like that to try to make it inclusive. But in the end, there's still catch-ups in the hallway when people walk out of the meeting, and there's still people stopping by desks because it's easier than a ping and they see the person. And that relationships one's the one I really worry is going to be harder for the virtual employees to show performance because they're just not able to do it quite as easily in person.
Yeah. I'd love to hear your response to that too, and any thoughts you have about how technology might play a role in new ways of socializing people and creating a new kind of FaceTime.
Yeah, when you were first asking the question, I was thinking just specifically about meetings and how those changed. So when I pre-pandemic, I was often joining meetings as the only person from New York with a bunch of people from California in the same room, and then we went all work from home for 2 years, and everybody was on their own little screen like we are right now. And so there's sort of, equity across the amount of sort of FaceTime or ability to chime into the conversation. And now as we're going back to the office, of course, that's no longer true. So just in a given meeting, you might have 3 people in one room, 2 people in another, and then a bunch of people on little screens. And so that's a topic we've been thinking about a lot, and sort of calling it collaboration equity. But how do we make sure that the experience isn't worse, or that there's equally good experience for all the different participants in a meeting, no matter where they're joining from? And so honestly, when we started to optionally open up the office, we saw a lot of people who were in the office were having the worst experience because we created all these internal tools like emojis popping up in the video screen, or in message in conference, sorry, in video call chats and so forth. And the people who were joining from the office didn't have that because they had the screen on the wall. They didn't have the app associated with it, right? So that's a space where we're working on a lot of different tech and space solutions to try to solve for within any given meeting. Absolutely, yes. And then, to Julia's point about sort of the slightly more zoomed out view of like, are the people who are permanently remote or, choosing never to be in the office, like what happens to them? I think it's too early to say right now whether there are going to be downstream career impacts. Like, we just don't have that data since we're only just coming back to the office. But we've been thinking a lot about how do we prevent that from being the case, right? And especially if we happen to find that, certain demographics tend to want to be remote more. As a new mom, for example, definitely crossed my mind. Like, I could spend a lot more time with my kid if I stay home and work from home for the rest of, while my kid is growing. But if that is the overall trend, and then we also see career implications for people who aren't in the office, like that's a huge problem down the line. And so we're definitely keeping a close eye on it to make sure that that's not what happens. And then in terms of technology to solve for it, I think we were in the fortunate position of being ahead of the curve with our, we just have so much software and so forth that can support asynchronous and distributed work that it was harder for some jobs who were more used to the office setup, but for many workers, it wasn't a huge transition to be able to work from home.
Yeah, really interesting and challenging. So I have another question here. What are your thoughts on the apparent increasing number of freelancers in professional services, and how can firms prepare for or cope with this trend? Julia, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to. And certainly we're seeing it in terms of the variable talent. And speaking of hybrid meetings, hopefully you can't hear my dog barking in the back. Apologies if you can. But essentially, there's projections that as much of 50% of the workforce will be freelancer or contract labor or whatever you want to call it by 2030, which really, if you believe that number, has a staggering impact to your organization. And obviously there's pros and cons, and then regulatory concerns in terms of this talent. But I do see, generally speaking, companies like mine trying to embrace the contract labor. And basically, we, for example, have built a external talent marketplace where freelancers can basically upload a resume, upload a profile. And we then, when we need someone for a project, we look through what's there. A lot of companies are doing this and trying to better leverage that talent via talent marketplaces. So, we're definitely seeing companies dip their toe in deeper and deeper in this space to leverage that and have more flexibility in terms of how they staff talent, and that'll help them, better navigate dips and spikes. If right now we're on a spike and all the people applying for those talent marketplace jobs are, doing really well and getting staffed very quickly. But obviously for us, it's also how we want to navigate dips. So we're able to, better treat our employees and make sure we're prioritizing them. So, it's real. And I think a lot of people are embracing this now, especially because it's so easy. You don't have to travel. You don't have to be in person. And it's really just shifting that focus towards skills.
Yeah. Do you think
I'll chime in?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that, the wording of the question, it says, how can firms prepare and cope with this trend? And I think in some industries it is a sort of prepare and cope, and in other industries it is take advantage of the flexibility of not having to offer someone permanent employment, which causes its own issues as well. But so I would say, Google's probably in a similar position to PwC in terms of, taking advantage of flexible employment opportunities instead of thinking of it as something that we have to defend against per se.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder, we talked earlier about onboarding and integrating people into the work community. Do you see that as the same kind of challenge with contract workers, or is it a greater challenge, or is that something we've already learned something about doing? Any thoughts?
I think we don't generally, the contract employees are typically, brought on for a very specific project. And so, it's sort of project based. There's not a lot of focus on community building, I guess, if that's what you're asking. It's sort of more, you might become.
But if this this ends up being a very large fraction of our workforce, I wonder whether that will have to change.
Yeah, and there's so many considerations too. Like I remember prior to pandemic, I was working as a contractor with one of our clients in that traditional Monday through Thursday model, and I was about to go on parental leave, and they threw me a baby shower. I'd been there for so long; I was sort of integrated as part of the team, and I recall the team getting a slap on the wrist because that's treating the contractor like an employee. And, now if that's true, are you really getting into sort of regulatory trouble? Should you be giving that person benefits? Now, I was contracting through PwC, so this was more about their broader policy. But, it's true. Like you want to create a team where you've got a sense of trust and you can, that you can go ahead and give someone an assignment and they're going to be able to run with it and not have to restorm form norm over and over again. So I think there's this very blurry line with contractors where you want to make sure, they're far enough away that they shouldn't be considered an employee. And that, like I was hitting on, that you're using them in, small bursts. But I think the reality is people get used to people, they start thinking of them as teams, and the natural inclination for if you meet someone who's good is to just bring them along. So I think we've got a lot more to work out in that space and how we manage it.
Yeah, it's certainly what you want to have happen. They're part of a team. Just got another question that's interesting. Are you seeing any negative effects from companies that are mandating return to office?
Yes.
That's a surprise answer.
Yeah, no, we even, when we're talking with clients, we even talk about, if you're requesting people come in, and I'll take the PwC example just as a hypothetical, but, we're saying our hybrid model is 1 to 3 days. Now, from a measurement perspective, yes, we're, looking generally speaking at occupancy of the office and how many desks are reserved and badge swipes, but are we going back to teams and saying, no, you specifically weren't in 1 to 3 days? No. We're looking at really performance outcomes and making sure teams are, doing the best they can. We're listening and constantly getting employee feedback. I think the positioning, companies need to really think about that positioning. Is it a mandate? Is it a recommendation? And if it is a mandate, we can all read the news about the companies that have been really public about mandates and what the actual numbers of return to office are, right? They're really struggling with the employees who've gotten used to working remotely, and they're starting to see employees vote with their feet. I don't have data on this, but it's anecdotal feedback from so many of my clients that I almost feel like it's true. But one big thing I'm hearing, especially among senior leaders, is I've really embraced flexibility for myself. And while my company is pretty public about going back, I'm not going back in full yet. I'm going back when it makes sense. I'm using the office purposefully. I'm there for my teams. We're in constant touch. We're communicating. But when the company makes me go back, that's when I'm going to go somewhere else and look at all the options I have. And I'd say that's a pretty constant, a pretty consistent sentiment from most of my clients, including very senior people at a lot of these big organizations.
Yeah. Iowa, what are you seeing in the tech world?
Yeah, I think mandating return to office is definitely, people will vote with their feet. And I sort of alluded to it earlier, but if we start getting to tracking people and saying, you didn't go in your 3 days or whatever it is, that would be certainly problematic. It sort of goes back to what people are asking for is that autonomy and flexibility. And even if I do want to be in 3 days a week, sometimes I have a doctor's appointment or need to take my dog to the vet or something like that. And I certainly don't want to be penalized for making those choices that make sense to my work and my life, right? So definitely agree there. I think, the other trend I'm seeing, and it's interesting, Julia, for you to say that you're seeing leaders who are saying they're going to do what works for them and sort of keep that going. I think I've seen the opposite as well across the industry, right? Which is that a lot of times our leaders are the ones who are saying, and not just at Google or something, but who are they grew up in the office first culture, and that's what they know, and that's what they want to get back to as soon as possible. But often they also have their own offices, and they're not out with everyone, fighting for a meeting room, right? And so I think there's definitely a push from leaders across the tech industry and probably other industries to say, no, everyone has to be back in the office, and that's not what many employees want, right? Although lots of employees do want sort of that hybrid kind of options to do both. So
I realize I'm asking for lots of anecdotal data, and we won't have large amounts of consistently collected data for a while. But do you have the feeling that there are populations that actually prefer to be in the office? Or in person with each other?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think generally speaking, most employees that we're surveying, there's so many surveys about, do you want to work all remote? Do you want to work all in office or somewhere in the middle? And the vast majority look like they're 10%, and then everyone else, the other 80% is in the middle hybrid, and they want to have flexibility. I do see the reasons people want to come in the office being very much for new joiners, especially around wanting mentorship opportunities, wanting coaching, wanting, the social aspect, especially think about New York City, a lot of individuals working in their apartments which they might share with others who are also working remotely. They want to get out. They don't want to be in that environment every day. So we are seeing, at the bottom end of this desire to be in some, and then like Iowa was describing at the top end, leaders wanting to be in some, and some of the leaders feedback we're hearing, it's about the setup. They're used to, really leading from the office, walking around, getting the feel. It seems to be those individuals who have been in a job for a longer period of time. And especially we're hearing caregivers, whether it's of working parents or individuals who have some other a pet, like all the COVID dogs and cats and things like that, or out caring for a family member, a loved one, who especially are saying, look, I've been in this job. I know how to do it. I have flexibility now, and I can kind of manage both things a little bit better. That seems to be the population that is less inclined to want to go back to a 5-day-a-week schedule.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So another question here. Early on in the pandemic, women were opting out of the workforce at a higher rate than their male counterparts. Have you seen a correction now that things have stabilized, or maybe they haven't stabilized, or are women's careers permanently impacted?
I don't have data on it, but I haven't really seen the correction yet. Probably it's stabilized. But if you think about, the individuals who opted out 2 years ago, and how quickly a lot of the ways of working have changed, especially around digital skills, and all the new technologies that employees are adopting and have been spending time over the pandemic adopting, I do really worry that there's a permanent impact to careers, because it's just going to be a lot to pick up on that. Plus, learn the new ways, the collaborative technologies, the technical digital tools. So, we're seeing a lot of companies put in place return programs and more part-time programs and things like that are made for women, often working mothers who have kind of opted out of the workforce, and trying to entice them back. But, we're also in interviews and talking to women who are looking for those jobs. They're also trying to make sure they come back for something that's not just to pay the bills. Iowa, you hit on this earlier, the concept of meaningful work. And can you really make a meaningful contribution with one of these part-time jobs? or is that one of the jobs that's going to be, setting the path for their organization? So I think that this is a really tricky area that most companies haven't quite figured out yet.
Yeah, I agree. I think at Google, we were able to not mirror the general trend of sort of losing more women early on in the pandemic because we have the resources to very quickly institute policies to help. So we did carers leave, for example, which was an expanded 3 months of fully paid leave that you could take no questions asked in increments of a couple hours a day. If you had anybody you need to care for, but with school shut down, a lot of it was for kids. But if someone was sick or anything like that, so we don't see those trends, and we haven't seen any negative career impacts yet. And I don't want to say yet with the assumption that it'll happen, but whatever's happening in the larger environment, usually it still happens, in even wherever you are, right? So I think it's an area that we're also really worried about. And trying to keep an eye on to see if there's any indication that things are going in the wrong direction, then what do we do about it, and how do we intervene to make sure that that's not what happens? Yeah.
So all of these things we've been talking about have a bearing on what our students want or need, maybe both. How do you think we should be adapting what we teach our students, or the experiences we provide them with in undergrad and MBA programs?
When I think about the skills that have really emerged during the pandemic as the most valued skills and the ones that have been helpful for individuals during all this, I think adaptability and curiosity and learning acumen probably are somewhere around the top of the list in terms of the ones that have helped people pre-pandemic go through it, navigate everything. Individuals who have a lot of resilience have done well on my teams and done well amongst our clients. And we're even seeing clients say, hey, can you help us think about a training program or a leadership development program that has these elements in it, so that we can, make sure for the next pandemic we're building, a more resilient workforce. So I think it probably, when I think about it was 15 years ago and I was at NYU, I would try to invest in courses that help you think about that and navigating, turbulent times, both just tactically with doing work, but also emotionally. So you're able to just, if something comes your way, whether it's negative feedback or constructive feedback or just a hard time, you're able to kind of navigate it and depersonalize it.
I think, speaking of anecdotal evidence, I have this sense that students are appreciating that more already and opting more for courses that help them understand their place in their work life and things like that. But maybe we can do a better job of helping them understand the value of those softer skills. Iowa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really tough. When I was at NYU, I was teaching the undergrad management and organizations course, an undergrad management course, right? Strategy, structure, culture, et cetera. And it's really hard to have the perspective when you haven't been in the workforce to understand why those softer skills are really hard and so critical. So I feel the pain, but I really agree with Julia, the navigating ambiguity, and how do you teach that in a classroom? I'm not sure, but being able to sort of navigate ambiguity is really important. Resilience is something we've really focused on at Google. It is tough, right? Because it's hard to tell people 2 years into a pandemic, be resilient. That's not very helpful. We kind of have to build up those skills prior, but we do have a lot of resources to help folks with that. And then, to touch on an earlier point, I think the relationship building skills are also just really important, especially in this increasingly distributed world, right? It's weird, the networking thing is weird for lots of people, but it's not that, right? It's something else. And so I think that's another one of those skills that it's just critical for success.
Yeah, it's interesting. We are still in the process of learning what how best to manage these things, both as employees and as employers and managers of teams and coaches of students. So we're having to create these experiences and this learning as we're learning it ourselves, which is why it's very helpful to have people like you to talk to on panels like this. So I think we're at the end of our questions. Rob, do you want to wrap it up?
Yes. Hi, Iowa and Julia, thank you both so much for joining us. I learned a lot from hearing everything that you had to say. And Kim, thank you so much for doing a masterful job of moderating the discussion. So just very briefly to wrap things up, I want to, in addition to thanking Iowa, Julia, and Kim, I want to thank all of the audience for tuning in to the discussion today. And once again, thank you to everybody. That's it for today. Have a great rest of the day.